Hello and welcome to a presentation on Dante's Purgatorio. My name is Matthew Zimmerman, and this is the semester project for ENG/PHS 583, Dante's Divine Comedy, Thomistic Philosophy in Narrative, taught by Dr. Christina Olson at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. Today's date is March 25th, 2022, the Feast of the Annunciation. The Purgatorio, of course, is the second of the three parts of Dante's Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy starts with the Inferno, then goes to the Purgatorio, and then on to the Paradiso. Our focus here is going to be on, of course, the Purgatorio, specifically on the manner in which Dante is purified from vice and sin as he ascends the Mount of Purgatory. Specifically, even more, to focus on a very prominent element of this, those seven cornices on which we find the penitents being purified of the seven deadly sins. And we'll go over how that is accomplished at each of the cornices, but the focus primarily is going to be on Dante and how Dante's experience of ascending Mount Purgatory is going to be a purification for him as well. He's going to be cleansed of vice, turned away from sin and from its effects and from inclination toward it. And we're going to see how each of these seven deadly sins is eradicated from Dante's soul at each cornice. How he grows in virtue, how his growth in virtue progresses throughout his ascent. And lastly, what signs are there of this eradication of vice and this development of virtue? The focus of this project will be on the Purgatorio, of course, and particularly on the way in which Dante is purified of vice and sin as he ascends Mount Purgatory. And the focus will also primarily be on the seven deadly sins, which the sinners are cleansed of on the top seven cornices or levels of Purgatory. The first four are known as Anti-Purgatory, and these last seven are really Purgatory proper. And we're also going to examine, to a certain extent, how the sinners in each of the cornices are purified, but primarily we're going to emphasize how Dante himself experiences this purification, how each of these seven deadly sins, pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust, are purified from Dante's soul at each cornice, and how Dante develops, not only is he going to eradicate these vices, he's also going to develop the opposing virtues throughout his ascent. And we're also going to look upon some of the signs that we see of this eradication of vice and consequent development of virtue in Dante until at that final moment at the top of the seventh cornice, he passes through that wall of flame and enters the earthly paradise. The point at which we shall begin to accompany Dante and Virgil is at the gate of Purgatory, right after they have ascended through Anti-Purgatory. Now, leading up to this gate, there are three stone steps. The first of them is white. The second is a dark blue-black color. And the third is red, a brilliant red. And this gate is guarded by an angel. And the angel is holding a shining sword, and before he allows Dante and Virgil to go through this gate into Purgatory itself, he carves 7 P's, 7 instances of the letter P, into Dante's forehead with the tip of this sword. And each of these symbolizes one of the 7 deadly sins. And of course, as we see from the design of Purgatory, the 7 cornices which lie above this gate each contain the penitents who are suffering and doing penance for one of these 7 deadly sins. So, of course, starting off with pride and ending with lust, as they ascend higher, they are purified of that particular sin. So, as Dante continues on, we're going to see how at each level he is cured of one of these scars on his forehead. One is taken away at each cornice after he completes the purification therein. Now, one thing that I should add about this gate of Purgatory is that the angel instructs Dante and Virgil to not look behind them once they have passed through the gate. And if they are to look behind them, then they will find that they have actually not gone through the gate, and they'll be right back on the other side, needing to pass through it again. And I think what we see here is that the penitents who are arriving and passing through this gate need to make a clean departure from sin and truly desire and will this penance which they shall be undergoing in order to ultimately ascend toward the heavens. And so, arriving in the first cornice, the vice which Dante will be cured of here is pride. Now, as defined in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, pride is undue self-esteem or self-love which seeks attention and honor and sets oneself in competition with God. So, keeping this in mind, we can see the punishment for pride and the penance undergone by the sinners here is to be weighed down by heavy stones as they walk along the edge of the cornice and gradually and very slowly ascend. And you can see here in Virgil's words, the grave condition of their torment twists them toward the earth. In this kind of, I guess you could say, exaggerated pose of humility, which in reality is countering that pride, that excessive self-esteem and self-love which they demonstrated in their lives. But also keep in mind, as we're going over the punishments of the sinners here, that unlike those sinners which we encounter in the Inferno, the sinners in the Purgatorio have hope. So this isn't a place of hopeless suffering where everyone is distressed and anguished by the knowledge of the fact that they have renounced God and separated themselves from them. The penitents here are genuinely suffering, but they have hope, knowing that their sufferings will someday come to an end and they will be able to then be worthy of seeing God face to face. So, yes, this is the first cornice, and the prideful are weighed down by the stones. And so Dante, in his own experience of this, he's distressed at seeing the sufferings of these sinners, and he's instructed by the whip of pride, and then a little later on by the rein of pride. Now, the purpose of the whip is to give examples of humility and of those who have overcome pride. The rein is kind of the opposite in a way. It shows the effects that pride has and the ruin which it causes, and the suffering and ultimate undoing of those sinners, of those people who have allowed pride to destroy them. So here we have a quote from Dante after he's been instructed by the whip and the rein. He says, "I wish not, reader, that you should despair of the good proposed for hearing, how God wills that the debt be paid. Dwell not on the form of the martyrdom, consider what succeeds it, that at worst it cannot run beyond the grand sentence." So here, even in the midst of his own penance, we see Dante exhorting his readers to not fear what lies ahead in purgatory, and to really accept the purification that will come to them there as a necessary step in being able to ascend to heaven, to see God face to face. At worst, it cannot run beyond the grand sentence. I think what he's saying there is that the sufferings of purgatory will come to an end, unlike the sufferings of the inferno. So then, here, coming to the end of this first cornice, Dante and Virgil are then greeted by an angel, and this angel beats upon Dante's forehead with his wings. And recall again, the forehead is where the angel at the gate of purgatory had carved the 7 P's. And this angel removes one of these P's. So from here on out, or for the next cornice, Dante is only going to have 6 P's. He's been purified of the vice of pride and instructed in humility. Now that Dante and Virgil have ascended from the first cornice, they come to the second cornice, in which we find the envious. Now, envy, as defined again by the Catechism of the Catholic Church, refers to sadness at the sight of another's goods and the immoderate desire to acquire them for oneself, even unjustly. Now, we see here a link between envy and pride. Envy can be seen in one sense as a refusal of charity, and indeed frequently has its origin in pride. So just keeping that in mind, we see that this cornice of the envy contains rock walls that are of a bluish color, kind of symbolizing the bruising nature of envy and of sins of envy. Initially, Dante doesn't see any souls here in the cornice of envy, but then he catches sight of some. And these souls are dressed in garments made of haircloth. And what's interesting is that they depend upon one another for support as they make their way slowly up the second cornice. I think they're very closely positioned together, and they kind of steady one another as they ascend. So in addition to these aspects, their eyes are sewn shut with a thin iron wire. So the envious are unable to see, and just as in life they use their vision to perceive and then to envy the goods of others, then now here in purgatory, their eyes are sewn shut, so they're deprived of that ability. But of course, there is hope for them. They're going to eventually make it out of this state. So anyway, Dante then, as we, similarly to what we saw in the previous cornice, he hears the whip of envy, and he hears the examples of charity which it presents. Then he converses with a soul here in the second cornice, Sapia of Siena. And Dante admits to her that in his case he's struggled against pride more so than envy, which is interesting because he's just come out of the first cornice and has been purified of pride. But recall again, he hasn't yet reached the river Lethe and been purified of, or freed of the memory of sin. So even though he says that he struggles more with other sins than with envy, Dante still is fearful when he hears the reign of envy. He in fact draws near to Virgil to seek some kind of comfort from this. And the reign of envy takes the form of a voice, two voices to be exact. The first one says, "Whoever seizes me will slaughter me." And then we hear in the second voice, "I am Agloros, who is turned to stone." Now, Agloros obviously is the speaker of the second one. The first part of the reign of envy is spoken by Cain, and Cain is lamenting the fact that he has ostracized himself through envy from the rest of mankind. Agloros apparently was turned to stone as a result of some kind of envy. And we can see here that these are the wretched effects of this vice. So soon thereafter, after Dante hears the whip and the rain, converses with Sapia, he then is greeted by an angel. And this angel casts great light upon the poets and then invites them to ascend up a stairway to the third cornice. And this ascent is easier than the previous ascent because Dante has been purified of envy. In contrast to the great light which Dante and Virgil see as they are invited to ascend out of the second cornice, they're greeted in the third cornice, the cornice of the wrathful, by a dark, thick, blinding smoke of a bitter and burning kind. And it's in the midst of this smoke that the wrathful do their penance. Now let's again go to a definition. Wrath is a sin which results from a failure to control anger. And anger itself is an emotion, and it's not by itself wrong. Nonetheless, it becomes wrath when, and here's a quote from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it becomes wrath when it is not controlled by reason or hardens into resentment and hate. So, keeping that clarification in mind, we can look upon this dark and blinding and bitter smoke as a smoke of wrath, with that acidic nature about it. Now, these penitents in this smoke are singing and praying to the Lamb of God, and they maintain a perfect harmony with each other's words and in the way that they sing. And as John Chardy notes, this is opposite to the discord and the disharmony which are created by wrath. So these penitents, as they're atoning for their sins, they're practicing the opposite. And this, of course, is on the third cornice. Now, Dante's experience of the third cornice really begins with the smoke, and then after that, and after hearing the singing, he converses with the soul of Marco. And Marco is a Lombard in the third cornice, who is doing his penance for wrath. Apparently, Marco is also a very talkative soul, because he and Dante have a lengthy conversation on the lack of virtue in the world. In fact, Marco says to Dante, "The world is all so well desert now of every virtue, as you tell me, and pregnant with malice, and covered in it." So the two of them discuss what might be the causes of this, and after that conversation, Dante and Virgil emerge from the smoke. And Dante is quite relieved at this, but is almost immediately greeted by a vision in which he's presented with the rain of wrath. And like the previous rains, This is the occasion for Dante to see examples of the harm which wrath brings upon its victims. So after seeing this, Dante then ascends out of this third cornice. But even after ascending, he's quite tired. He feels a fatigue brought along by his experiences. "O my strength, why are you drawn off?" So he's been purified from wrath, but it's taken a lot out of him. In the fourth cornice are the souls of the slothful. Now, thinking about what sloth is, we can return again to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Sloth is a culpable lack of physical or spiritual effort. Keep in mind those two elements, both physical and spiritual. So this again is on the fourth cornice, and these souls are running hurriedly around this cornice. And this, as John Chardy explains, this is to atone for their delay in pursuing the good. Just as they were reluctant and slow in pursuing the good, and so now they're atoning for it by proceeding very quickly with no delay. And this is evident in their words: "Swiftly, swiftly, that time not be lost in little love, that, laboring for good, might make grace green again." You see that urgency with which they're now pursuing the good as their penance here in the fourth cornice. Now, I don't think that it is by coincidence that Dante arrives in the fourth cornice feeling fatigued. Nonetheless, he is arrived, and he hears the whip of sloth. And this is spoken by two of the souls who are leading this group of souls who are proceeding very hurriedly around. "Mary rushed in haste to the hills, and Caesar to subjugate Ilerda, burst upon Marseille, and then raced to Spain." So there's an urgency here. Again, giving both a religious and a secular example. Something that Dr. Mahfoud has mentioned repeatedly as a characteristic of the Divine Comedy as a whole. And we see this again here in the reign of sloth. "Those for whom the sea spread were dead before the Jordan saw their heirs, and those who didn't bear the breathlessness to the end with the son of Anchises gave themselves to lives devoid of glory." So here again in the whip and the rain, we see the whip encouraging urgency in pursuing the good, and the rain showing the bad effects of sloth. So following this, we have a rather peculiar scene. Dante falls into a dream, and he dreams of the siren. And in this dream, she appears as beautiful and enticing, but then suddenly she is stripped of her garments, and her true hideousness is revealed, and the stench that arises from her is so awful that it awakes Dante from his sleep. Now, the exact positioning of this dream here in the fourth cornice of the slothful, I think, has some significance for Dante. Now, exactly what he intends, I'm not entirely sure, but I think perhaps what we can ascertain from this is that to be slothful and to be reluctant in pursuing the good is something that it seems alluring on the face of it, but in the end results in quite a bad state in which we have failed to attain the good. And so after this dream, or nightmare as you might have it, an angel that shows Dante and Virgil the way out of the fourth cornice. This seems to be a theme here as Dante ascends. He's shown the path out by an angel and then guided by Virgil through that path. And now Dante has been cleansed from sloth, and he may continue on in his journey. Here we have the fifth of the 7 deadly sins, avarice, in the 5th cornice of Mount Purgatory. And here, Dante and Virgil find the souls of the avaricious, and it should be noted that these souls, this term avarice, refers to both the hoarders and the wasters. So when they speak of the souls of the avaricious, it includes both of these categories, which we remember from the Inferno. However, these are the hoarders and wasters who died in the state of grace and need to be purified from that vice in order to ascend to heaven. And of course, they have hope, unlike their counterparts in the Inferno. So, to describe the situation of these souls, let's just turn to the words of Pope Adrian V. And he's a soul with whom Dante has a conversation, and this is what he describes. He says, "Just as our eyes would not adhere to that above, fixed on earthly things, so justice here has bound them to the earth. As avarice spent our love for every good, so that its operation was lost, so justice here constricts us, our feet lashed and our hands bound. And as long as it pleases the just Lord, so long shall we stay stretched immobile." So anyway, these souls of the avaricious are bound and tied to the ground, face down, and as such they are immobile. And perhaps one way of kind of thinking about this is to see these souls of the avaricious as not being able to pursue or to see or covet the many things that they would have hoarded or wasted in their lives. So in that way, they're purified of this vice. So Dante seems to spend quite a bit of time conversing with 3 souls that he mentions in this cornice of the avaricious. These are Pope Adrian V. We just saw his words on the condition of the souls. Then Hugh Capet, and then Statius. And the second of these souls, Capet, presents to Dante this reign of avarice, giving 7 different examples of the destructiveness that is created by avarice. And, in addition, Dante does hear from another soul the whip of avarice. In this case, he's very pleased to hear this whip. And among other examples, we hear the example of the generosity of St. Nicholas, who saved the young women from a terrible state. And so then Dante, as he's going on, he hears an earthquake, and he's very curious to know the cause of this earthquake. And I believe it's either mentioned here or elsewhere that this earthquake transpires when a soul ascends out of purgatory toward heaven. And Dante here again has one more P removed from his forehead. Sometimes Dante mentions this in specific, other times he just kind of implies it. Here's one of the times when he actually specifically states that an angel removes a P from his forehead. And he notices that his ascent is going much more easily than before. There's a certain lightness in his step with which he can ascend to the 6th cornice. Interestingly, when Dante and Virgil ascend from the fifth cornice to the sixth cornice of Purgatory, they appear to be accompanied by Statius, and Statius and Virgil continue on in their conversation. And in the ascent, as one of the first things that Dante notices once he reaches this cornice where the gluttons are, is a tree with lush foliage and ripe fruits. And it is from this tree that the whip of gluttony proceeds. It's a voice spoken by the tree. For this food you will hunger. And so the gluttons, those who have overindulged in food and drink in their lives, have the appearance of those who have suffered from starvation. And here's Dante's description of this. Each was dark and cavernous of eye, pallid in the face, and so diminished that the skin seemed formed solely by bone. And Dante is taken aback by their appearance, and then he converses with a number of the gluttons. And what's interesting here is to recall that even though these people are in a horrible state, again they have hope, and their condition is better than that of the gluttons in the Inferno, who were obliged to eat mud and filth from the ground. So, keeping that in mind, let's now look at Dante's purification here. He's heard the whip of gluttony, and it proclaims, Mary thought more about the wedding feasts being furnished as wished than about her own mouth, which prays for you now. And the ancient Roman women, for their drink, were content with water, and Daniel disparaged food and acquired wisdom. So once again, we see examples from classical history and from biblical history. So Dante hears the whip and also the rain, which is spoken by the tree of knowledge, and speaks of, as all the rains have, the ill effects and the destruction which comes about as a result of the various vices, and in this case, gluttony. So one thing to note here in the sixth cornice is that Dante spends a great deal of time in conversation with the souls who are here doing their penance. So finally, after making his way through this cornice, there's an angel with intense light. This angel greets Dante and Virgil and directs them upwards out of the sixth cornice. And this light that comes from this angel is quite brilliant. And Dante says of this angel, never now has glass or metal in a furnace been so lucent and red. And Dante even has to shield himself behind Virgil, by stepping behind Virgil, because this light is so bright. Now, he's been purified here of 6 out of the 7 deadly sins. But perhaps his brilliance is still too much for him. Perhaps Dante still needs further purification. And once that is attained, then maybe he'll be able to look on this brightness and not feel the need to be shielded from it. It's interesting as his purification goes on how things change in respect to his response, particularly to the angels, but also to his surroundings. And finally, Dante and Virgil come to the 7th cornice of Mount Purgatory, the final cornice, and here they find the souls of the lustful. And the penance for these souls is to ascend in single file along a path that is entirely consumed by fire. And as such, they gradually make their way upward through the flames. And throughout this whole ordeal, they sing the hymn Sume Deus Clementiae, and they'll sing it once and then they'll continually repeat the hymn. But between each rendition, they will then announce the whip of lust, giving a new example of chastity at each point, after each repetition. And then, after Dante sees this and hears the hymn and the whip of lust, he's then just about to answer some questions from another group of souls when there's yet another contingent of them who comes by and announces the reign of lust, interrupting his conversation, in fact. So then he's going through this seventh cornice, seeing the souls and hearing the whip and the reign of lust. He then reaches the upper periphery of the cornice, and there learns from the angel of chastity that he must pass through a sheet of purifying fire in order to complete his own purification and be ready to go into the earthly paradise, which is at the very top of purgatory. And this is an occasion of great terror for Dante. And he hasn't really shown this degree of fear throughout the entirety of the Purgatorio. Nonetheless, Virgil reassures him and tells Dante that this flame will bring about purification, but yet not in any way cause harm to him or afflict his body in any way. So then Dante enters the flame, and of it he says, "I would have flung myself in boiling glass for my refreshment, so measureless was the burning there." And without a doubt, this is the the greatest example of suffering that we see for Dante in the entirety of the Purgatorio. So he spends time in this purifying flame, which is very intense, and either in the midst of the flame or immediately thereafter by an angel, the last remaining pea on his forehead is removed. And so, going back to the gate of purgatory, 7 cornices below, where the angel carved 7 peas in Dante's forehead, each of those peas has been removed as Dante has ascended through the cornices and been purified of each of the 7 deadly sins. So, yes, now that he's been purified of pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust, we see Virgil speak to him. And this is the moment when Virgil's guidance has run out, as it were, and human reason can proceed no further. And here we find Virgil's parting words to Dante. "You've seen the temporary place and the eternal, son, and you've come to that part where I can discern no further on my own. I have drawn you here with genius and with art. Now take your pleasure for your guide. You are out of the steep way. You are out of the narrow. You see the sun that lights your brow again. You see the new grasses, the flowers, and the arbors. The earth here produces of itself alone, while those lovely eyes come elated, which, weeping, made me come to you. You may sit or you may walk among these beauties. Await no further word nor sign from me. Your will is free, erect, and sound, and it comes to error not to do as it indicates. Thus I crown and mitre you over yourself." And reflecting on these words, we see, once again, Virgil is telling Dante of the limit of human reason and how human reason has taken Dante all the way through the Inferno and through the Purgatorio, but now he must have a new guide in order to ascend into heaven. That guide, of course, will be Beatrice, whom we will meet in the next few cantos. In addition, one thing that's noticed here as well is the fact that Virgil is telling Dante that his will cannot lead him into error, and that he can do whatever his will inclines him to do. And that can only be the case if Dante has been purified of vice. And because of this purification, his will is no longer going to suggest things to him that are sinful and that are not in accord with human nature, because it's been purified of vice. And particularly this coming right on the heels of that final wall of fire, that very intense and burning heat that makes boiling glass seem like a refreshment. This is really a profound statement by Virgil. And as we see his final words here, it's a bittersweet moment. We know that better things are ahead for Dante, but at the same time, Virgil has been such a faithful guide to him. Oddly enough, it should also be mentioned here that despite the fact that he's been purified of all sin and all vice, Dante still has 2 more steps to go through before he can enter heaven. He must be washed in the river Lethe and purified of all memory of sin. And then he also must wash in the river Unoi, where all the memory of goodness and virtue is then strengthened in him. And toward that end, as he then ascends into the earthly paradise, he meets Matilda, and Matilda brings him into the waters of Lethe, cleansing all memory of sin from him, and then guides him over toward Unoi, where he's strengthened in goodness, and finally, at last, is able to ascend toward the heavens and toward the stars.